I'm Sharon Stone. This is Engage.
Earlier this year, Governor DeSantis signed into law SB 418, a bill that would require law enforcement training that would improve interactions with people with cognitive conditions, including Alzheimer's and spectrum disorders. Law enforcement agencies are increasingly finding themselves responding to missing persons alerts involving cognitively impaired Central Floridians, and a lack of training in identifying the markers of these conditions have created awkward and sometimes violent confrontations between police and people with cognitive issues. The training is mandatory and will be required for candidates to receive law enforcement certification in Florida. It will help officers identify people who may have autism spectrum disorders or Alzheimer's, teach law enforcement communication techniques to create smoother interactions and better de-escalation tools, and provide what are called blue envelopes to hold auto registration and insurance information, telling police officers the person they are interacting with has a cognitive condition. Gene Saunders is the founder and CEO of Project Lifesaver, the nonprofit that has developed the training program that Florida police will use. The organization educates more than 1,500 law enforcement agencies in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and much of Canada. They have been cultivating the program since 1999, evolving with the science behind our understanding of autism spectrum disorders. He's been a sworn law enforcement officer for nearly 60 years. He joined Engage to discuss the need for this kind of training. Saunders began our discussion by explaining why Project Lifesaver came to be.
In the, I'd say probably late 80s, early 90s, we started noticing an increase of searches for Alzheimer's patients. At that time, we didn't know much about searching for them. We just used our regular search techniques that we had learned for searching for what we would classify as maybe a normal person or a cognitive person. Well, we found that we were not very successful in many of our searches, and this bothered me. Well, in the mid-90s, the sheriff's office took over the search and rescue function, and as an agreement, I went as a volunteer, still working for the police department. Same scenario was still going on. In about 1995, I got a brochure on wildlife tracking. And the thought occurred to me, if we can track wildlife and locate them, why can't we adopt that technology and do it with people that are at risk, such as Alzheimer's patients? So I got with a manufacturer. We were able to come up with something such as a wristband bracelet. And in 1999, I placed the first one on a gentleman in Virginia Beach, and that started it. We had a rescue about a month and a half into the program. It took us a minute and a half to locate the gentleman in a locked closet in an apartment hallway. And then I started getting calls from all over Virginia. They wanted to do the program, and gradually that expanded out to other states across the country and even into Canada.
Well, you've been a sworn law enforcement officer for nearly 6 decades. Do you recall a specific incident while you were on duty that you felt a program like this would have been helpful?
Just about every time we did any searching when I was on duty, I felt like if we had some way of locating these people quickly, the results probably wouldn't be as tragic or negative. This thing always was in the back of my mind, especially when you do a search for a person and you do it for 2 or 3 weeks and using every resource you have available and you don't find them. And then months later, their remains turn up within your search area, stumbled across by a hunter or a citizen. And then you go back and what did we do wrong? How did we miss them? And these kind of things just kind of haunt you.
Now, the program began with a focus on people with Alzheimer's. When did it expand to include people on the spectrum?
About 2 years into the program, a very good friend of mine who was a U.S. Marshal in Norfolk, Virginia, called me, and he had heard about the program, and he had a son, a 6-year-old son that was on the spectrum. And he was what was described by his father as a runner. Wanted to know if we could use this particular technology for people on the spectrum. Well, back at that time, you have to understand it was just called autism. Nobody referred to it as being on the spectrum. Well, I was a little anxious about it because my first thought was, which was erroneous, was, well, tracking and locating an elderly person with Alzheimer's. That's one thing, but now we're talking about a 6-year-old child that is probably going full speed and no telling where they're going to end up. But even with those thoughts in mind, I did a little research, found out autism was not very well known back then. In fact, the only statistics I could find was that autism was recorded in 1 in 10,000 children. Anyway, I talked again to my friend and said, yeah, we'll go ahead and try this. Well, it grew rapidly. And now not only do we do those on the spectrum, anyone with a cognitive disorder that may have wandering as a characteristic, or however you want to term it, wandering, eloping, running, it all goes back to the same thing. They're leaving the safety of their home or facility, and now they're in danger.
One of the most tragic stories we hear on a regular basis, unfortunately, in Central Florida, is how a lot of these children who are on the spectrum, who have a propensity for wandering, find themselves attracted to bodies of water.
Yeah, I often wondered about that. What is it that attracts them about water? I've talked to a number of people, advocates, and people in the medical field and the psychology field, and the only one that ever gave me an answer that I could wrap my head around was the children are looking for peace and serenity, and they go to the water because it's the closest thing that they can find to the womb. The water offers them peace, it offers them serenity, offers them quietness. However, they don't understand cause and consequence. Cause is you're in the water, consequence is if you can't swim, what happens? And that was probably the only one that I ever heard that I could really say, yeah, there's some merit to that explanation. But yes, they are largely attracted to water, which really means the clock is ticking against you big time when they go, because you're talking minutes instead of hours.
In the years that you've been working with law enforcement agencies around the country, what have you heard from the officers, from the boots on the ground, regarding the traditional training and how it's impacted their encounters with people either on the spectrum or who are living with Alzheimer's?
Well, up until the 2000s, at least where I'm from in the Commonwealth of Virginia, there was no training for either one. We had a 1-hour block in our training in the basic school, and it was titled Mental Retardation, which hardly covered anything. We first on the scene was the Alzheimer's situation, and that gathered traction. And finally, our criminal justice people in the Commonwealth said, well, I think it has merit enough that we need to have regular Alzheimer's training. Well, autism is still somewhat, I don't want to say ignored, but it's not held in the situation that it should be. I think autism and those on the spectrum is a population that has just boomed. In fact, the agencies that are our members, we're hearing more about them having people on the spectrum than they do Alzheimer's or dementia patients. The training was woefully inadequate or none at all. And I think this is why you had so many incidents involving law enforcement and those on the spectrum that ended negatively. I applaud the fact that it is now being recognized more and more. Because one thing about being a law enforcement officer out there, the more you know about the people you're going to interact with, how to recognize what may be going on with them, the more you can respond in the way you should and not overreact.
So let's talk about the program itself insofar as it'll be presented in Florida. What are some of the key points that officers will be taught, and what are some of the tools they'll be taking into the field that they didn't have before?
Well, one thing is just how to recognize what you're dealing with. And if you do recognize it, what are some of the tools you can use to, say, de-escalate a situation? Or how do you communicate with somebody that's on the spectrum? Suppose you run into one that's on the spectrum that does echolalia, where they repeat what you're saying. Well, they're not really mocking you as you might have believed beforehand. And I've had that situation. So how do you get them to comply with what you need them to do and do it safely without coming into a force situation? Well, how do you recognize, or when do you recognize that, okay, we're going to have to use some element of force to resolve this situation? Where is that line? How do you know? Knowing what you're dealing with and knowing some of the characteristics of it and knowing how to communicate with them, I think is a big factor. The other is, okay, if they go missing, what are the things you need to be looking for? Where do you need to look? Like we talked earlier, first place you look, anything that's got water. But there's some other clues you may want to bring into factor in looking at this. Were they supposed to be doing something or going somewhere and the plans changed unexpectedly? They may still be concentrating on whatever it is you had planned to do. And that's where they may be trying to go. So there's a lot of things that officers need to understand and realize. And now you got a lot of them on the spectrum that are high functioning that are starting to drive. All right, you make a traffic stop. You start to talk to this person. I think the fact that this person would have some type of identification that places them on the spectrum and tells the officer is going to be a big help in the communication and the interaction with the person. Let's face it, any tools that you have that will make a situation resolve itself successfully is something that is needed by all the officers in the field.
Gene Saunders is founder and CEO of Project Lifesaver. SB 418 will go into effect on July 1st.
Engage is a production of Central Florida Public Media. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Richard Copeland is our senior producer. I'm Sharon Stone. You can reach us anytime with questions, comments, or story ideas. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Thanks for listening.